Welcome to the Ghastly Journal, where the darkest corners of human experience are what we explore. To a small town in northern England, 1977, is where tonight's story takes us, where one boy's ordinary life was about to be consumed by something beyond all understanding. The story of the boy the shadows watched, this is, even while he slept. Particularly harsh was the winter of 1977 in the small mining town of Blackthorn. Situated in the north of England, the town had always been somewhat isolated, surrounded by dense forests and rolling moors that seemed to swallow the landscape during the winter months. It was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, where gossip traveled faster than the evening train to Leeds, and where traditions ran as deep as the coal seams beneath their feet. In this town lived 11-year-old Oliver Harker, a quiet, thoughtful boy with unruly brown hair and eyes that seemed to take in everything around him. Unlike many of the other children in Blackthorn, Oliver preferred solitude to company. While his peers spent their afternoons playing football in the streets or riding their bikes through the town square, Oliver could often be found sitting by the window of his bedroom, sketching the world outside or losing himself in books about distant places and fantastical adventures. With his parents, Oliver lived in a modest two-story house on the outskirts of town. His father, Thomas Harker, worked in the local coal mine, returning home each evening with coal dust permanently embedded in the creases of his hands and the corners of his eyes. At the local library worked his mother, Margaret, part-time, which explained Oliver's love for books and stories. A close family they were, though the recent economic troubles had cast a shadow over their home, as it had over the entire town. On a Tuesday, just after the Christmas holidays had ended, the trouble began. School had resumed, and Oliver had returned to his usual routine of walking home alone, cutting through Willow Park to avoid the longer route that would take him past the older boys who seemed to delight in tormenting him. That afternoon, as Oliver made his way through the park, the sky overhead was a canvas of dark, brooding clouds that threatened snow. The park was empty, save for an old man feeding the pigeons by the frozen pond. Oliver had seen him before, a fixture in the park regardless of the weather, always surrounded by a fluttering mass of gray and white. A simple acknowledgement, a nod, the old man gave to Oliver as he passed, which the boy returned with a slight wave. It was as Oliver approached the exit gate that he first noticed something odd. In a way that couldn't be explained by the movement of branches in the wind, the shadows beneath the trees seemed to shift. He paused, staring at a particularly dark patch beneath an ancient oak. For a moment, just the briefest instant, Oliver thought he saw the shadow ripple, as if something moved within it. He blinked, and the shadow was just a shadow again. To his overactive imagination, something his teachers often commented on in his school reports, Oliver shook his head, attributing the strange sight. Oliver has a vivid imagination, they would write, but needs to focus more on reality. That night, as his mother tucked him into bed, Oliver mentioned what he had seen in the park. "Mom, do shadows ever move on their own?" he asked, his voice small in the darkness of his room. Margaret Harker paused, her hand resting on the worn quilt she had just pulled up to her son's chin. "What do you mean, love?" "In the park today, I saw a shadow. It moved, but there wasn't anything there to make it move." The kind of smile adults reserve for children when they say something endearingly nonsensical, his mother smiled. "Shadows need light and something to block that light, Ollie. They can't move on their own." "But what if?" "No more what ifs," she interrupted gently. "It's time for sleep." She leaned down and pressed a kiss to his forehead. "Remember, if you have a bad dream, Dad and I are just down the hall." Oliver nodded, though the unease lingered as his mother switched off the bedside lamp and left the room, leaving the door slightly ajar as she always did. The soft glow from the hallway light cast long shadows across his bedroom floor, and Oliver found himself watching them intently, half expecting them to move. He must have fallen asleep eventually, because the next thing he knew, he was waking up to the sound of his alarm clock. To the back of his mind were pushed the events of the previous day as he prepared for school. Though he couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. It wasn't until that evening, as Oliver sat at his desk working on his homework, that he noticed it again. The shadow cast by his desk lamp seemed to waver like a reflection in disturbed water. Frozen, Oliver watched, pencil hovering above his math workbook, as the shadow stretched and contorted in ways that had nothing to do with the stationary lamp. His heart pounding in his chest, Oliver slowly turned to look behind him, half expecting to see someone or something standing there. But his room was empty, save for the familiar furniture and the posters of his favorite bands on the walls. When he turned back to his desk, the shadow was normal again, a perfect silhouette of his lamp against the wall. Rubbing his eyes, Oliver wondered if he was more tired than he realized. Quickly, he finished his homework and went to bed early that night, pulling the covers up to his chin despite the warmth of the room. The next day at school, Oliver found it hard to concentrate. To the moving shadows, his mind kept returning, questioning whether what he had seen was real or just a product of his imagination. During lunch break, as he sat alone at his usual table in the corner of the cafeteria, he noticed one of the dinner ladies watching him. Mrs. Patterson was an elderly woman with a perpetual frown and eyes that seemed to follow the children as they moved about the room. As Oliver caught her gaze, she looked away quickly, but not before he saw something in her expression. Concern perhaps, or recognition. Strange enough it was that later, as he was leaving the cafeteria, he approached her. "Mrs. Patterson," he said tentatively. The old woman looked up from wiping down a table. "Yes, Oliver." He was surprised she knew his name. He had never spoken to her before. "I was just wondering, why were you looking at me during lunch?" Mrs. Patterson's hands stilled on the table. She glanced around as if making sure no one else was within earshot, then leaned slightly closer to Oliver. "You look tired, boy. Are you sleeping well?" The question caught Oliver off guard. Yes, I think so." For a moment longer she studied him, her faded blue eyes seeming to look through him rather than at him. "If you start having trouble sleeping, or if you see things that shouldn't be there, you come and talk to me. You hear me?" Before Oliver could respond, the bell rang, signaling the end of lunch break. Mrs. Patterson straightened up and resumed her cleaning as if nothing had happened, leaving Oliver standing there, confusion and unease coiling in his stomach. The rest of the school day passed in a blur. About Mrs. Patterson's strange words and the moving shadows, Oliver couldn't stop thinking. A connection there was, he was sure of it, but he couldn't figure out what it might be. That afternoon, as he walked home, Oliver deliberately avoided Willow Park, taking the longer route past the row of shops on the high street. The sky was overcast again, a uniform gray that made the day feel later than it was. As he passed the butcher's shop, he noticed his reflection in the window walking alongside him. But there was something odd about it. The reflection seemed to lag slightly, moving a fraction of a second after he did. Abruptly, Oliver stopped, and his reflection did the same, but not immediately. A delay there was, tiny but noticeable. And as he stared at the window, heart hammering in his chest, he could have sworn that his reflection's expression didn't match his own. While his face was a mask of fear and confusion, his reflection seemed to be smiling just slightly. The corners of its mouth turned up in a way that made Oliver's blood run cold. He took a step back, then another, before turning and running the rest of the way home, not stopping until he had slammed the front door behind him. "Oliver, is that you?" his mother called from the kitchen. "Yes, Mom," he replied, trying to keep the tremor out of his voice. Margaret appeared in the hallway, wiping her hands on a tea towel. "You're home early. Is everything all right?" Oliver hesitated. He wanted to tell her about the reflection, about the shadows, about Mrs. Patterson's strange warning, but he remembered the dismissive smile from the night before and decided against it. "Everything's fine," he said instead. "Just cold out." His mother nodded, seemingly satisfied with this explanation. "Well, go wash up. Dinner will be ready when your father gets home." That evening, as the family sat around the dinner table, Oliver picked at his food, his appetite diminished by the day's events. His father noticed, of course. Thomas Harker didn't miss much despite his quiet nature. "Something on your mind, son?" he asked, his voice rough from years of coal dust and cigarettes. Oliver looked up, meeting his father's concerned gaze. Dad, do you believe in things that can't be explained, like ghosts or monsters? A glance Thomas exchanged with Margaret before answering. I believe there are many things in this world that we don't understand. Why do you ask? Oliver shrugged, pushing a piece of potato around his plate. Just wondering. Has someone been telling you ghost stories at school? His mother asked, a note of disapproval in her voice. No, nothing like that, Oliver assured her quickly. Just curious. The conversation moved on to other topics, but Oliver caught his father watching him thoughtfully throughout the meal. After dinner, as his mother cleared the dishes, Thomas gestured for Oliver to follow him into the living room. Sit down, Ollie, he said, settling into his favorite armchair. Oliver perched on the edge of the sofa, hands clasped between his knees. Now tell me what's really bothering you. There was something in his father's tone, a seriousness that convinced Oliver that maybe, just maybe, he would be believed. So haltingly at first, then with increasing urgency, he told his father everything. The moving shadows in the park and in his room, Mrs. Patterson's strange warning, and the reflection that didn't quite match his movements. When he finished, Oliver braced himself for laughter or dismissal, but Thomas Harker's expression remained grave. For a long moment he was silent, his eyes fixed on the empty fireplace as if the answers could be found in the cold ashes. Have you seen anything else? He finally asked. Anything out of place? Oliver shook his head. No, just the shadows and the reflection. His father nodded slowly. Listen to me, Oliver. I want you to pay attention to your surroundings. If you see anything strange, anything at all, I want you to tell me immediately. Don't try to investigate on your own. Understand? Yes, Dad, Oliver replied, relief washing over him at being taken seriously. But, what do you think it is? Thomas rubbed a hand over his face, suddenly looking much older than his 40 years. I don't know, son, but Blackthorn has always had its secrets, and some things are better left alone. That night, Oliver lay awake in bed, his father's words echoing in his mind. Blackthorn had always had its secrets. What did that mean? What secrets? And why did his father seem to know something about what was happening? As these questions swirled in his head, Oliver became aware of a strange sensation. It felt as if he was being watched. The feeling was so strong that he sat up in bed, eyes scanning the darkened room. The shadows in the corners seemed deeper than usual, more solid somehow. Is someone there? He whispered, immediately feeling foolish. Of course, no one answered. But as he lay back down, pulling the covers up to his chin, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was there in the room with him, watching and waiting. It took him hours to fall asleep, and when he did, his dreams were troubled by shapeless figures that moved just at the edge of his vision, always disappearing when he tried to look at them directly. The next morning, Oliver woke feeling exhausted, as if he hadn't slept at all. At breakfast, his mother commented on the dark circles under his eyes, but Oliver brushed off her concern. He couldn't explain that he was afraid to sleep, afraid of what might be watching him in the darkness. School that day was a blur. Oliver moved through his classes mechanically, his mind elsewhere. During lunch, he sought out Mrs. Patterson, determined to ask her what she knew. But the old dinner lady was absent. Another woman was taking her place in the cafeteria. Where's Mrs. Patterson? Oliver asked the substitute. Called in sick, the woman replied disinterestedly. First time in 15 years, apparently. This news only added to Oliver's unease. Was it a coincidence that Mrs. Patterson was absent the day after her cryptic warning to him? Somehow he didn't think so. After school, against his better judgment, Oliver decided to take the shortcut through Willow Park again. He needed to see if the shadows would move in the same place. Needed some confirmation that he wasn't losing his mind. The park was eerily quiet as Oliver entered through the rusty gate. The old man who fed the pigeons was nowhere to be seen, and even the birds seemed to have abandoned the area. The trees stood like silent sentinels, their bare branches reaching toward the gray sky like skeletal fingers. Oliver made his way along the path, his footsteps crunching on the frost-hardened ground. He was approaching the ancient oak where he had first seen the moving shadow when he noticed something odd about the tree. There appeared to be a dark opening at its base, like a small cave or hollow. Curiosity overcoming his fear, Oliver moved closer. The opening was about 3 feet tall, just large enough for a child to crawl through. It was utterly dark inside, a blackness so complete that it seemed to swallow the weak winter light. As Oliver stood staring at the hollow, a whisper seemed to emerge from within, so faint that he almost thought he had imagined it. He leaned closer, straining to hear. Oliver. The sound of his name, spoken in a voice that was neither male nor female, young nor old, sent a jolt of fear through him. He stumbled backward, nearly falling in his haste to get away from the tree. And then he saw them, shadows moving across the ground toward him, detached from any physical object. They flowed like water, converging on the spot where he stood, frozen in terror. Oliver turned and ran, not stopping until he had left the park far behind. He didn't slow down until he reached the high street where the presence of other people provided some sense of safety. Breathing heavily, he leaned against the wall of the post office, trying to make sense of what he had just experienced. The hollow in the tree, the whispered name, the shadows moving independently. It was too much to be explained away as imagination or tricks of the light. Something was happening in Blackthorn, something connected to him specifically, and Oliver was determined to find out what it was. With newfound resolve, he decided to visit the local library. If Blackthorn had secrets, as his father had suggested, perhaps there would be records, newspaper articles, or local history books that might provide some answers. The Blackthorn Public Library was a small Victorian building at the end of the high street. Oliver's mother wouldn't be working today, which was a relief. He didn't want to explain what he was researching. The elderly librarian, Mr. Jenkins, barely looked up as Oliver entered, too engrossed in his cataloging to pay much attention to the young visitor. This suited Oliver fine as he made his way to the local history section at the back of the building. The shelves were dusty and clearly not frequently visited. Oliver ran his finger along the spines of various books. A History of Coal Mining in Northern England. Blackthorn, A Pictorial History. Folklore and Legends of the North Country. This last one caught his attention, and he pulled it from the shelf. The book was old, its binding cracked, and pages yellowed with age. Oliver took it to a small table in the corner and began to flip through it, looking for any mention of Blackthorn or moving shadows. After an hour of searching, he was about to give up when a chapter title caught his eye, The Shadow Folk of Blackthorn Woods. Heart racing, Oliver began to read. Among the most persistent legends of the North Country is that of the Shadow Folk, entities said to inhabit the ancient forests surrounding the mining town of Blackthorn. Unlike traditional spirits or fae, the Shadow Folk are described as beings composed entirely of darkness, able to move independently of light sources and physical objects. Local folklore suggests that the Shadow Folk were once human, transformed by a curse placed upon the town in the 16th century by a witch who was executed on charges of consorting with the devil. Before her death, she is said to have prophesied that the shadows would claim the children of Blackthorn one by one until her own bloodline was restored. Throughout the centuries, there have been sporadic reports of children in Blackthorn experiencing strange phenomena involving shadows, moving darkness, reflections that act independently, and whispered voices from unseen sources. These incidents typically culminate in the disappearance of the child. Though in some cases, intervention by those knowledgeable in old protections has prevented tragedy. The most recent documented case occurred in 1932 when 7-year-old Emily Patterson claimed to be followed by people made of darkness. The girl disappeared 3 weeks later while walking home from school. Despite extensive searches, no trace of her was ever found. Oliver's blood ran cold as he read the name Patterson. Could Mrs. Patterson be related to the missing girl? Is that why she had warned him? He continued reading, learning that the Shadow Folk were said to be most active during the winter months, particularly in January, the current month. They were attracted to children who were in some way marked, though the book was frustratingly vague about what this marking might entail, and they would watch their chosen victim for days or weeks before attempting to take them. The hollow tree was mentioned as well, described as a gateway between the world of humans and the realm of the shadow folk. According to the legend, children who entered the hollow were never seen again, their essence absorbed by the shadows to maintain their unnatural existence. Oliver closed the book with shaking hands. It was too specific, too similar to his own experiences to be coincidence. The moving shadows, the reflection that didn't match, the hollow in the oak tree, and the whispered voice. It all aligned with the legend of the shadow folk. But why him? What made him marked? And more importantly, how could he protect himself? The book had mentioned old protections, but provided no details on what these might be. Oliver needed more information, and he suspected he knew someone who might have it. The next day was Saturday, meaning no school. Oliver told his parents he was going to a friend's house to work on a school project. A lie that made him feel guilty but seemed necessary. Instead, he made his way to the small row of council houses on the east side of town where Mrs. Patterson lived. He had gotten her address from the school secretary, claiming his mother wanted to send a get-well card. Another lie. But these small deceptions seemed insignificant compared to the danger he believed he was facing. Mrs. Patterson's house was identical to those on either side of it, distinguishable only by the neatly kept garden and the heavy curtains that covered all the windows despite the daylight outside. Oliver hesitated at the gate, suddenly uncertain. What if she refused to see him? What if she thought he was crazy? Before he could reconsider, the front door opened and Mrs. Patterson stood in the doorway. She was dressed in a faded house coat, her gray hair loose around her shoulders instead of in its usual tight bun. She looked older and friendlier outside of the school setting, but her eyes were as sharp as ever. "I've been expecting you, Oliver Harker," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the small front garden. "You'd better come inside." Surprised but relieved, Oliver followed her into the house. The interior was dimly lit, the heavy curtains blocking most of the natural light. Every surface was cluttered with strange objects, jars filled with herbs, crystals of various colors and sizes, old books with worn leather bindings, and peculiar metal symbols that Oliver didn't recognize. Mrs. Patterson led him into a small sitting room and gestured for him to take a seat on an ancient sofa. She remained standing, studying him with an intensity that made him uncomfortable. "You've seen them, haven't you?" she finally said. "The shadows." Oliver nodded, relief washing over him at her immediate understanding. "Yes, they're following me. And I found a hollow in an oak tree in Willow Park." "You went near the hollow?" Mrs. Patterson interrupted, alarm clear in her voice. "Did you touch it? Did you reach inside?" "No," Oliver assured her quickly. "But I heard a voice coming from it. It said my name." Mrs. Patterson closed her eyes briefly as if in pain. "Then it's already begun," she murmured. She opened her eyes and fixed Oliver with a stern gaze. "Did you read about them? The shadow folk?" "Yes. At the library, there was a book about local folklore. It mentioned an Emily Patterson who disappeared in 1932. My aunt, Mrs. Patterson confirmed. I was 5 years old when she vanished. Old enough to remember the warnings my grandmother gave, the protective measures she took to keep the rest of us safe. She moved to a cluttered sideboard and began rummaging through a drawer. The shadows took my aunt because no one believed her until it was too late. I won't let that happen to you." She returned with a small cloth bag which she pressed into Oliver's hand. "Keep this with you at all times. It contains rowan berries, iron filings, and salt. All things the shadow folk cannot abide." Oliver took the bag, feeling the irregular shapes within. "But why me? The book said they're attracted to children who are marked. But I don't understand what that means." Mrs. Patterson sighed, lowering herself into an armchair across from him. "The marking isn't physical, child. It's in your nature. The shadow folk are drawn to those with a particular sensitivity to the world beyond our own. Those who can see what others cannot, who feel what others do not. She looked at him intently. Your mother works in the library. Yes. Oliver nodded, confused by the change in subject. Yes, for as long as I can remember. And she brought books home for you from a young age. Yes. Books open doorways in the mind, Oliver. They create spaces where the impossible becomes possible. Sometimes those spaces attract attention from things that exist in the gaps between reality and imagination. Your mind is more open than most, more susceptible to influence from the other side. Oliver tried to process this information. So, because I read a lot and have a good imagination, these shadow folk are targeting me? It's more than that, Mrs. Patterson said, leaning forward. It's a kind of light inside you, a creative force. The shadows are drawn to it because they have none of their own. They exist only as an absence, a negative space. They hunger for the light they cannot produce. What will happen if they catch me? Oliver asked, though he feared he already knew the answer. Mrs. Patterson's expression grew grave. They will take you to their realm through the hollow tree. There they will consume your essence, your light, leaving nothing behind. You will become one of them, a shadow bound to their world, forced to help them hunt for more children to feed their endless hunger. A chill ran down Oliver's spine at her words. How do I stop them? The charm I gave you will provide some protection, but it won't hold them off forever. The only way to truly escape the shadow folk is to close the gateway they use to enter our world. The hollow tree, Oliver said. Mrs. Patterson nodded. The hollow must be sealed, but not with ordinary means. It requires a ritual, one my grandmother taught me after my aunt disappeared. She rose and crossed to a bookshelf, removing an ancient leather-bound journal. The instructions are in here, passed down through generations of my family. But I cannot perform the ritual alone. It requires someone they are connected to, someone they have marked. Me, Oliver said, understanding dawning. You need me to help close the hollow. Yes, and we must do it soon. Before the next new moon. That's when their power is strongest. When they will try to take you. Oliver glanced at the small calendar on Mrs. Patterson's wall. The new moon was just 4 days away. What do we need for the ritual? Mrs. Patterson opened the journal, running her finger down a page covered in faded handwriting. Silver dust, spring water collected at midnight. A personal item from you. Something meaningful. She hesitated. And blood. Just a few drops. Freely given. My blood? Oliver asked, his voice rising slightly. Yes, blood carries power, especially the blood of one they have chosen. It will bind the sealing spell and prevent them from opening another gateway nearby. She closed the journal and fixed Oliver with a serious look. I know it sounds frightening, but it's the only way to end this. Otherwise, they will keep coming for you, and eventually they will succeed. Oliver thought about the shadows that had chased him in the park, about the voice that had whispered his name, about the hollow tree waiting like an open mouth. The decision wasn't difficult. I'll do it, he said firmly. What's the plan? For the next hour, Mrs. Patterson outlined the ritual in detail. They would need to go to the hollow tree at midnight on Sunday, the night before the new moon. Oliver would bring a personal item. He decided on a small pocket watch his grandfather had given him before he died, and Mrs. Patterson would provide the other components. They would perform the ritual together, sealing the hollow and breaking the shadow folks' connection to Oliver. Until then, Mrs. Patterson warned as she showed him to the door, keep the charm with you at all times. Don't go out after dark if you can avoid it. And whatever you do, don't look directly at the shadows if they appear. They can pull you in through eye contact. Oliver promised to be careful and headed home, the small cloth bag clutched tightly in his hand. As he walked, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being followed. Several times he caught glimpses of movement at the edge of his vision, but when he turned to look, being careful not to look directly at any shadows. As Mrs. Patterson had warned, there was nothing there. By the time he reached his house, Oliver was nearly running. He burst through the front door, breathing heavily, startling his mother, who was in the hallway. "Ollie, what on earth?" Margaret exclaimed. "You look like you've seen a ghost." "I'm fine, Mom," Oliver said, trying to control his breathing. Just ran home because it looked like it might rain." His mother frowned, glancing out the window at the clear sky. "Rain? It's the clearest day we've had all week." Oliver followed her gaze, surprised to see that she was right. The sky was a crisp winter blue without a cloud in sight. But he was certain it had been overcast just moments ago as he was walking home. Had the shadows been manipulating what he saw? "Oh, I guess I was mistaken," he said weakly. "Anyway, I'm starving. Is there anything to eat?" The diversion worked, and his mother went to the kitchen to fix him a sandwich, the strange incident apparently forgotten. Oliver slipped upstairs to his room where he carefully placed Mrs. Patterson's charm bag under his pillow, hoping it would protect him while he slept. That night, Oliver's dreams were troubled. He found himself walking through Willow Park, but it was different, darker, more primeval. The trees were twisted into grotesque shapes, their branches reaching down like grasping hands, the path beneath his feet writhed as if alive, and the air was thick with a strange sweet smell that made his head spin. Ahead of him, the ancient oak tree loomed, its hollow entrance now a gaping maw large enough for a grown man to walk through upright. Darkness poured from the opening like liquid, pooling on the ground and forming shapes, human-like figures that moved with a terrible grace. One of the shadow figures stepped forward, its featureless face somehow still managing to convey hunger and malice. "Oliver," it whispered in the same voice he had heard from the hollow. "Come to us, Oliver. We've been waiting for you for so long." "No," Oliver tried to say, but no sound emerged from his throat. He tried to run, but his feet seemed rooted to the spot. The shadow figure drew closer, reaching out with arms that elongated impossibly. "You belong with us. You've always belonged with us." Just as the cold, dark fingers were about to touch his face, Oliver woke with a gasp, sitting bolt upright in bed. His room was dark, save for the thin strip of light coming from beneath his door. He reached under his pillow, reassured by the feel of the charm bag, then froze as he noticed something on his bedroom wall. A shadow, cast by nothing, was slowly sliding across the wallpaper. It had a vaguely human shape, but it moved in a way no human could, flowing like smoke against gravity. As Oliver watched, paralyzed with fear, it paused, seeming to turn toward him, though it had no face or features. Then slowly, a thin line appeared in the upper portion of the shadow, widening into what could only be described as a smile. A horrible, gaping smile that stretched beyond the boundaries of what a human mouth could do. Oliver squeezed his eyes shut, clutching the charm bag tightly. "Go away," he whispered. "Leave me alone." He didn't open his eyes again until morning. And when he did, the shadow was gone. But Oliver knew it had been there. Knew it wasn't just a nightmare. The shadows were getting bolder, coming into his home, into his bedroom. The charm was providing some protection. But as Mrs. Patterson had warned, it wouldn't hold them off forever. Sundays seemed to crawl by. Oliver stayed inside, claiming he had homework to finish. His parents noticed his subdued mood, but attributed it to ordinary childhood troubles. Oliver hated keeping secrets from them, but he couldn't imagine trying to explain about the shadow folk. They would think he was making it up, or worse, that he was unwell. As evening approached, Oliver grew increasingly anxious. He needed to meet Mrs. Patterson at Willow Park at midnight, but how would he get out of the house without his parents knowing? He had never snuck out before, had never even considered it. Dinner that night was a quiet affair. Oliver's father mentioned that there had been another layoff at the mine, and the mood around the table was somber. After they ate, the family gathered in the living room to watch television, a Sunday night tradition. Oliver sat on the floor pretending to be engrossed in the program while his mind raced with plans for later. At 9 o'clock, his mother announced it was time for bed. Oliver didn't protest. Seeing an opportunity in this early bedtime, he went through his usual routine, brushing his teeth, changing into pajamas. But instead of getting into bed, he lay on top of the covers, fully dressed underneath his robe. "Can I read for a while?" he asked when his mother came to say good night. "Just for a little bit," she agreed, kissing his forehead. "Don't stay up too late. You have school tomorrow." "I won't," Oliver promised, feeling a twinge of guilt at the deception. He waited until the house was quiet, until he heard his parents go to their own room and the soft murmur of their voices fade into silence. Then, moving with exaggerated care, he slipped out of bed and changed into warm outdoor clothes. He put the charm bag in one pocket and his grandfather's pocket watch in another, then eased his window open. Oliver's bedroom was on the second floor, but there was a sturdy oak tree outside his window, its branches conveniently close to the house. He had never climbed out before, but he had often thought about how it could be done if necessary. Now, heart pounding with a mixture of fear and determination, he eased himself onto the nearest branch. The climb down was nerve-wracking, but manageable. Once on the ground, Oliver paused, listening for any sound that might indicate his parents had heard him. The house remained silent, dark, except for the dim light in his parents' bedroom window. Taking a deep breath, Oliver turned and began the walk to Willow Park. The streets of Blackthorn were deserted at this hour, the only illumination coming from the occasional street lamp and the half-moon overhead. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat, and Oliver found himself walking in the center of the road, as far from the dark edges as possible. As he approached the park, a sense of dread settled over him. What if the ritual didn't work? What if the shadow folk were too strong? What if Mrs. Patterson didn't come? But as he reached the rusty gate, he saw a figure waiting on the other side. Mrs. Patterson, wrapped in a heavy coat, a large canvas bag at her feet. "You came," she said as he approached, relief evident in her voice. "I was afraid they might have prevented you somehow." "They tried," Oliver said, remembering the shadow on his bedroom wall, "but the charm helped." Mrs. Patterson nodded approvingly. "Good. Now we must hurry. We need to begin the ritual exactly at midnight, and we still need to prepare." She led the way through the dark park, following a path that Oliver could barely see. The trees loomed on either side, their branches moving slightly despite the absence of wind. More than once, Oliver thought he saw shadows detaching themselves from the trees, flowing along the ground in their direction, only to retreat when Mrs. Patterson held up a small metal object that gleamed in the moonlight. "Iron," she explained, noticing his questioning look. "They can't abide it." At last, they reached the ancient oak with its hollow trunk. It looked different in the darkness, more menacing. The opening seemed larger than Oliver remembered, and there was a faint glow emanating from within, a sickly greenish light that pulsed like a heartbeat. Mrs. Patterson set down her bag and began removing items. A small silver bowl, a vial of clear liquid, a packet of what looked like fine silver dust, and a sharp, small knife that made Oliver swallow nervously. "Don't worry," she assured him, seeing his expression. "We only need a few drops. It won't hurt much." She instructed Oliver to stand a few feet from the hollow, facing it directly, while she marked a circle around him with the silver dust. Then she poured the spring water into the bowl and placed it at the edge of the circle, between Oliver and the tree. "Now," she said, holding out her hand. "I need your personal item." Oliver removed his grandfather's pocket watch from his pocket and placed it in her palm. Mrs. Patterson examined it briefly, then nodded. "This will do well. There's strong emotional connection here." She placed the watch in the bowl of water where it sank to the bottom with a soft plunk. Then she handed Oliver the knife. 3 drops into the bowl, she instructed. "No more, no less, and you must do it willingly, with the intention of binding the shadows." Oliver took the knife with a trembling hand. The blade gleamed in the moonlight as he pressed it against the tip of his index finger. He winced as it broke the skin, then held his hand over the bowl, watching as 3 drops of blood fell into the water, creating swirling patterns as they dispersed. As the 3rd drop hit the water, a change came over the hollow tree. The greenish glow intensified, and a low moaning sound emerged from the opening, like wind through a narrow canyon, but with an undercurrent of rage and frustration. "They know what we're doing," Mrs. Patterson said grimly. "We must hurry." She began to recite words in a language Oliver didn't recognize, her voice growing louder as the moaning from the tree increased in volume. The shadows around them were moving now, flowing like water toward the circle of silver dust, but unable to cross it. Oliver stood rigid, fighting the urge to run as the shadows gathered, forming into distinct shapes, human-like figures with elongated limbs and faceless heads. They pressed against the invisible barrier created by the silver circle, their forms rippling with apparent frustration. "Oliver," the whisper came from all around, multiple voices speaking in unison. "Oliver, stop this. Come to us. You belong with us." "Don't listen to them," Mrs. Patterson said sharply, interrupting her incantation. "They lie. They seek only to consume you. Focus on the ritual. Repeat after me. I bind you to your realm. Shadows without light. I close this gateway with my blood and will." Oliver repeated the words, his voice gaining strength as he spoke. The shadows recoiled slightly, their forms becoming less distinct. Mrs. Patterson continued the ritual, instructing Oliver to take the wet pocket watch from the bowl and press it against the hollow of the tree. As he did so, a searing cold shot up his arm, so intense that he nearly dropped the watch, but he gritted his teeth and held it in place as Mrs. Patterson completed the incantation. "With silver, water, blood, and bond, I seal this passage. What was opened is now closed. What was broken is now mended. The shadow shall not pass." As she spoke the final words, the pocket watch in Oliver's hand began to glow with a warm, golden light. The cold receded, replaced by a gentle warmth that spread up his arm and throughout his body. The watch seemed to melt into the tree, the metal flowing into the wood like water. The moaning from the hollow rose to a terrible shriek, a sound of rage and despair that made Oliver cover his ears. The shadows surrounding them thrashed wildly, their forms stretching and contorting in apparent agony. Then, with a sound like a thunderclap, the hollow collapsed in on itself, the opening sealing as if it had never existed. The shadows dispersed instantly, fleeing into the darkness of the park. One moment they were there, pressing against the silver circle. The next they were gone, leaving nothing but the ordinary shadows cast by the trees in the moonlight. Oliver stood frozen, hardly daring to believe it was over. Mrs. Patterson broke the silver circle with her foot, then approached the tree, running her hand over the smooth bark where the hollow had been. "It's done," she said, her voice tired but satisfied. "The gateway is closed. They cannot reach you now." "Are they gone for good?" Oliver asked, finally finding his voice. Mrs. Patterson shook her head. "Not gone. They still exist in their own realm, but their connection to this world has been severed, at least in this location. They won't be able to return to Blackthorn for many years, perhaps decades. And they can't come after me anymore. No. The blood magic in the ritual broke their claim on you. You're free of them." She smiled, a genuine smile that transformed her usually stern face. "You were brave, Oliver. Braver than many adults would have been." But as they gathered the remaining ritual items and prepared to leave the park, Oliver had one last question. "Mrs. Patterson, how did you know they were after me? I never told anyone about the shadows until I came to your house." The old woman paused, her expression becoming distant. "I've watched for the signs all my life, ever since my aunt was taken. The shadow folk have patterns. They always begin with small manifestations, moving shadows, independent reflections, whispered names. I saw the way you looked over your shoulder when there was nothing there. I recognized the fear in your eyes." She placed a hand on his shoulder. "And I swore I would never let them take another child if I could prevent it." They walked back through the park in comfortable silence. The night seemed less threatening now, the shadows just shadows once more. At the gate, they parted ways, Mrs. Patterson heading to her home and Oliver to his. The climb back up to his bedroom window was easier than the climb down had been, fueled by a sense of relief and accomplishment. Once inside, Oliver changed back into his pajamas and slipped into bed. Exhausted, but no longer afraid of what might lurk in the darkness. He slept deeply that night, without dreams. And when he woke the next morning, it was to a room filled with ordinary winter sunlight. No shadows moved independently. No reflections acted of their own accord. The world was as it should be. Over breakfast, his mother commented on how well-rested he looked. "Those dark circles under your eyes are gone," she said, touching his cheek affectionately. "You must have slept well." "I did," Oliver agreed, smiling. "Really well." In the days that followed, life returned to normal. Oliver still took the shortcut through Willow Park, but now he did so without fear, even pausing sometimes by the ancient oak to touch the smooth bark where the hollow had been. His father never mentioned their conversation about unexplainable things, but sometimes Oliver caught him watching with a thoughtful expression, as if he knew something had changed, but couldn't quite put his finger on what it was. Mrs. Patterson returned to her duties at the school cafeteria, and if she treated Oliver with a certain fondness that she didn't show the other children, no one seemed to notice or care. Sometimes they would exchange a glance across the crowded room, a small acknowledgement of the secret they shared. Oliver continued to read his books and draw his pictures, but now he did so with a new awareness of the power of imagination and the thin boundaries between worlds. He was more careful about what he read before bedtime, more mindful of the shadows in the corners of his room, and he kept the charm bag Mrs. Patterson had given him, tucked safely in his bedside drawer, just in case. Years later, as an adult, Oliver would return to Blackthorn after university. The town had changed. The mine had closed, new businesses had opened, and many of the people he had known had moved away. But the ancient oak in Willow Park still stood. And when Oliver placed his hand against the trunk, he thought he felt a faint warmth, a resonance of the magic that had once been worked there. Mrs. Patterson was long gone by then, having passed away peacefully in her sleep during Oliver's second year at university. But her legacy lived on in the stories Oliver would eventually write. Tales of shadows and light, of courage and sacrifice, of the thin places where worlds touch, stories that would captivate readers around the world, though none would ever guess that they had their origins in the real experiences of a young boy in a small mining town in northern England in the winter of 1977. And if sometimes Oliver thought he glimpsed a shadow moving oddly at the edge of his vision, or heard a faint whisper of his name in an empty room, he would touch the small charm bag he still carried and smile, unafraid. For he knew the truth about the shadows now, and knowledge, as Mrs. Patterson had taught him, was the greatest protection of all. As for the ancient oak in Willow Park, it remained unmarked by any hollow or opening. But locals would sometimes comment on how the shadows beneath its branches seemed deeper than they should be, especially in the winter months. And children would dare each other to stand beneath it at midnight, though none ever did. For some stories are passed down through generations, their details changing, but their warnings remaining the same. Beware the shadows that move on their own, and never, ever enter a hollow tree. And in the heart of Blackthorn, in a small house not unlike the one he had grown up in, Oliver Harker would sit at his desk late into the night, writing stories by lamplight, his pen casting shadows across the page. Ordinary shadows, nothing more. But sometimes, just as he was falling asleep, he would remember the cold touch of the shadow figures, the whispered voices, the hollow tree with its sickly green glow. And he would wonder if somewhere, in some other realm, they still remembered him, too. The boy the shadows watched, even while he slept.